compared with what I thought 28 years ago, and most of us do change our minds about things over a period that long, I don't think economics has much to say about whether particular businesses ought to be in private or public hands. Some economics says that natural monopolies, of which Hydro Tasmania is one, perhaps ought to be publicly owned to prevent the exploitation of monopoly power by private interests, as undoubtedly does occur. But beyond that, economics doesn't have any firm conclusions as to whether the public sector is more or less efficient than the private sector, and I personally don't have any.
Saul Eslake, you as much as any other Tasmanian has been critical of the state's government position and what appears to be a worsening position. Is this a fire sale by a Tasmanian government desperate to reduce the rate at which debt grows in the state?
Well, that might be the case if they sell assets at prices that don't reflect the underlying value of the assets being sold. And that's something that I hope I will come to a view on. In particular for me, and I said this in the review that I did pursuant to the agreement between the Premier and the Lambies last year, a critical question is, will the interest that the government saves from using asset sales proceeds to pay down debt outweigh the income tax equivalents and dividends it receives from continuing to own those assets? And what I also said was that the situation today in that respect is very different from what it was in the 1990s when lots of governments on the mainland were privatising electricity and other assets, because interest rates on government debt were much higher than they are today, and because GBEs weren't paying as much in dividends to state governments as, particularly in Tasmania, they now are. So the financial arithmetic behind decisions to privatise is both different from and more onerous than it was 25, 30 years ago. And that, to me, as an economist, giving advice to the government is probably the most important consideration that I will have. The question of whether something ought to be publicly or privately owned is really ultimately a political decision, not an economic one.
And indeed, much of that will be debated in Parliament as, the Treasurer said. I'm imagining that in some cases, ministers can just decide in Cabinet and with Cabinet support to make decisions about the sale of some state assets. Others will need to come in front of the Parliament for scrutiny and an endorsement or otherwise on the floor. It's an interesting time. Saul Eslake, do you have any timelines that you've been given for when this work needs to be done?
No,
very briefly?
No, I haven't. As I said, I haven't been given any formal terms of reference by the government. I haven't been given a timeline. We haven't even had a negotiation as to what I might get paid for doing what could be a substantial piece of work. So there are a few hoops to go through before I can start undertaking this task. But I do want to emphasise to people who are listening to this program that I don't have any preconceived notions about this, and I'll be going into it with an open mind and with a determination to reach whatever conclusions I do based on economics, not on politics.